This episode of Inside EMS is brought to you by Lexipol, the experts in policy, training, wellness support, and grants assistance for first responders and government leaders. To learn more, visit lexipol.com. That's Lexipol.com. Well, it's Friday, and everybody knows when it's Friday, it's time to go Inside EMS. I am your host, Chris Cebollero. Kelly Grayson is on special assignment, bringing education, knowledge, skill, training, abilities to the next generation of EMS provider. But have I got a show for you? Sitting in the co-host seat, I am going to call him a co-host, is my friend, Matt Zavadsky, and he is here to talk about what's going on in Fort Worth, Texas, with the MedStar system as it transitioned to Fort Worth Fire. But Matt, I want to welcome you back to Inside EMS. Before you say hello, I do want to tell you this. I do keep good records. This is your 10th time you've been on Inside EMS. If we're like Saturday Night Live, you are the Alec Baldwin of the Inside EMS podcast, by the way.
Please don't ask me to do a Donald Trump imitation.
No, we're not going to do that. But from a co-host side, Rob Lawrence still holds that honor. But from a guest side, you are the number one guest that we've had on this show over 10 years, 600 shows, 2 million listens.
Wow. And Chris, it is such an honor to do it with you. You're one of the people that I have respected all through the recent part of my career since I met you. We met at MedStar back in 2008.
We sure did.
So a very, very warm spot in my heart for Chris Cebollero.
Thank you. And you said it just like I wrote it, so that does make it even better. But Matt, I do want to give a little bit of history. So as you mentioned, I started at MedStar in 2000. I left in 2010. I started off as a field paramedic, field training officer. I had the opportunity to become the clinical coordinator and the clinical director, and had the opportunity to actually run the operations about 3 times in my tenure, as there were leaders coming in and out. And that was when you came in 2008. I had the opportunity to hold the system down, waiting for the next leader. But, you know, when we think about this from an organizational standpoint, when we think about this from a history of EMS, MedStar is a great organization that has set the standard for others to follow for many years, steeped in tradition. Everybody, it seems, in Fort Worth and the surrounding cities have worked at MedStar or hung their hat at MedStar. And this really does come at a huge surprise for this, for EMS. So maybe if people don't know what we're talking about, give them just a brief overview of what's happening with MedStar, or what could potentially be happening with MedStar in the coming months.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for that introduction. MedStar is unique, and it's a public utility model system. Was created by the city of Fort Worth, as a matter of fact, in 1986, and then grew to be owned by about 14 different other cities. And for the last decade and a half, MedStar has been known locally, nationally, internationally for innovation, transformation, high performance, high value EMS, just like many other public utility model systems. The problem was, like most EMS systems across the country, whether they're public, private, fire, non-fire, hospital-based, the economics of EMS have dramatically changed, especially since the pandemic, because of exceptionally fast rising costs and stagnant revenues. Payment reform can't come fast enough, but costs are skyrocketing. Primarily personnel costs, but also ambulances, infrastructure, etc. So despite being able to operate with no tax subsidy for the last decade, we were put in a position where if the community wanted to have the same service level, and primarily defined as response times, that'll be a whole nother topic, Chris, for us to talk about on another podcast, then we're going to need public funding. And for the city, they wanted to have an external review of the system. And Chris, I see you smiling and nodding your head. MedStar has been reviewed since I've been here, since 2008, 4 times.
Right.
And every one of those reviews said, yep, best system in the country, least expensive, highest clinically performing, just under-resourced.
Right.
in terms of personnel and really money. Is what it comes down to. Um, so they contracted for consultant. Consultant came in, gave them 4 options for the future. One of the options was keep the system as it is. MedStar is going to need about $3.5 million annually to meet the response time goal. And to be fair, and credit to Steve Knight and Thomas Moore from Fitch and Associates, they did a really good job of telling the city council this laser focus on response times really isn't a thing.
Mhm.
And they said many studies have been done that have showed any response time greater than 5 minutes doesn't make a difference in the patient's outcome, and the response time in 5 minutes or less only applies to about 1% of the call volume. And in their study, they said, so really any response time goal established for an EMS system is really public policy. It's not based on clinical medicine, because you get there in 10 minutes, you get there in 20 minutes, you get there in 60 minutes. For the vast majority of the calls, doesn't matter. But he laid out 4 options for the city, one of which $3.5 million, keep MedStar. The other 3 were transition to a city-based service, either third service government like Austin Travis County EMS, like Medic, Mecklenburg, etc. At 9 or 10, actually about 15 million, I think. Transition it into the fire department, and 2 options to transition into the fire department: civilian employees or civil service employees. The city council's committee on EMS made it pretty clear that they really liked the civil service fire-based model, even though it was $10 to $20 million in expense, as opposed to the 3.5 for keeping the MedStar system essentially intact, some modifications.
Yeah.
So that looks like, Chris, where they're going with this. There's actually a meeting today as we record this at 1 o'clock Central Time, where the city council at a work session will get a briefing from the committee of the city council that's been looking at this, with a formal recommendation to go to a civil service single role provider in the Fort Worth Fire Department doing ambulance service for the city of Fort Worth and ostensibly the other 13 cities that are part of the EMS authority, but under the city, no longer an independent governmental authority through that joint agreement.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And it really dovetails and transitions well into the next question I had was, MedStar, when I was there, it was Fort Worth and 13 surrounding cities. What happens with the 13 surrounding cities now? Did they get to be part of the system, or do they have to find their own system, their own solutions?
Fort Worth and us have reached out and had extensive communications with the other member cities. The reality is that in the EMS authority, Fort Worth represented about 90% of our response volume. And there's no economic clinical model where the remaining jurisdictions absent Fort Worth can get a clinically proficient, economically efficient solution. So our recommendation to the other member cities was to honestly negotiate their best deal with the city of Fort Worth now. Under our system, because it was an independent governmental authority, the assets rest with the authority,
That's right.
unless
Yeah.
all the member jurisdictions agree to dissolve the authority. If they all agree to dissolve the authority, then the assets go to the member cities. So if one of the member cities chose not to allow or not to agree to the dissolution, that means that the city of Fort Worth would have to spend a boatload of capital to buy ambulances, to buy facilities, because the MedStar assets would not be available to them.
I see.
So Ken Simpson, our CEO, and others, and really talked to the member cities and said, negotiate your best deal right now with the city, because you're holding a $60 million carrot that would be to your benefit and to the city's benefit. So just negotiate the best deal that you can right now, because again, you're in an excellent position to work with the city of Fort Worth to have them continue as your provider under the new model.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many questions that come from that really kind of, um, I don't even know where to go, to be honest with you. But one of the things that you said, which I thought was really interesting, and when we think about the budget that MedStar has, it's pretty considerable. But when we talk about $3.5 million, and then you say $20 million to run the system from the fire side, what happens to that other money that is in the budget? And even moreover, as this just hits me in so many different ways, uh, with a $64 million budget a year that MedStar has, how do you make up that 20 to 64? Then number two is, why just not drop the budget to 60 million or 55 million to do this work?
And Chris, we to minimize the impact of deficit spending, we had already done as much squeezing of the sponge as we could. Um, the reality is that, like with many EMS agencies or fire departments or any organization, the lion's share of the expense is the personnel. And the only way to really make a difference in the spend is to reduce personnel.
Yeah,
Our folks were already turning a unit hour utilization on the response side, a response UHU of 0.63, 0.65. So that, as you know, is a very highly utilized system.
right.
And what Fitch said in their assessment was, forget the response time. Let's talk about the workload. The goal of the any type of system revision should be reducing the workload on the field staff to about 0.5, because a 0.5 UHU is much more reasonable
Yeah,
than a 0.6, 0.65. And the reason, by the way, that we ran a 0.6, 0.65 was we had to, right? Because we could only afford to hire a certain number of people and balance the budget or minimize the impact in the expenses. So what Fitch said was, with a $3.5 million infusion of cash annually, MedStar can hire enough people, change pay rates, hire enough people to get down to a 0.5 UHU. And we agreed, because we'd been asking for 3.5 to 4 million as part of our projection to really achieve the response times that the community wanted based on unit hour utilization. The fire department model, starting at 10 and probably going to closer to 20, includes a bunch of things that civil service requires, pension payments and a bunch of different things. And everybody agrees that when you put something into a fire service, generally the costs are going to be much more expensive.
right.
What's interesting is that the 10 million, 12 million, $20 million estimates that are out there includes a reduction in overhead positions of about 20%, 30%. So okay, so if you kept all those overhead positions, um, then it would be even more money. Well, that's sort of what we've been saying all. Now by overhead, it's the logistics techs who stock the trucks, and it's that kind of thing. So um, it's interesting. We have been very supportive, very transparent. It was great to know or to hear that when Fitch reviewed all of our finances and looked at how we were spending money, their two comments were their budget is spot on. We backed into their budget and we got to within $6,000 on a $64 million budget. So it's pretty close. And they said we are shocked that they're able to collect the revenue that they're able to collect,
Right.
given the payer mix in the city of Fort Worth. And that just again shows a very highly functioning EMS system, let alone all of the mobile integrated healthcare and all those other things that we're doing.
Right.
Um, so, but we're supportive of the city council's decision, and our goal is to make sure that the transition goes smoothly, that the core components of what made this system unique and the best in the country remain through that transition,
Yeah.
and that the people are treated fairly.
No, and I think that that's a great point, and it puts a little bow on the whole thing. But I don't want to gloss over that, Matt. I want to be able just to say it again. So $64 million is all through billing and collection, right? There's no subsidy. When I first worked at MedStar, I think the city of Fort Worth paid a subsidy of about $400,000 to MedStar per year. And then MedStar eventually said, we don't need your money. I think we could be self-sufficient. We could do it ourselves. So you actually gave that back to the city of Fort Worth to say, I think we're on a good track. But $64 million is what you build. Well, maybe not what you build, but it's what you
We
collected
collected.
to
Yeah.
make this system work. So when we talk about there's no money in EMS, it really depends on the system in the market as to what you can collect. But Matt, help me with this math a little bit. So Fort Worth is saying, $20 million to do this. You and I know that the biggest percentage of a budget, 80% usually, is the workforce. That's still $51 million. How do you take a $51 million payroll and put it into $20 million?
So, and again, Chris, depending on the model, it's 10 million, 12 million,
Yeah,
20
yeah.
million. It's
We
it's
don't
still a
know.
little bit, as the city manager's office says, it's still a little squishy.
Yeah.
Just trying to figure out what that's going
Squishy's
to
a
look like.
good word.
Yeah, that's what they use a lot. Um, Remember, that's the gap. That's the gap between revenue and expense. So, and we know that revenue is king, right? Because you really want to collect that. We've been able to do a really good job, and for years, and Chris, from being in the system, our cost per call was the lowest in the state, probably the lowest in the country for, maybe except for providers in Mississippi, whatever. But
Mhm.
um, almost by 3 times. So the average cost to put an ambulance in front of an address in Texas, according to the cost reports that we all have to file for the public GEMT program,
Mhm.
our cost is $461 to put an ambulance in front of an address. The average for non-fire providers in Texas is $1,200. The average for fire providers in Texas is $2,600. So if you're not collecting $2,600, if you're not collecting $1,200, we were able to collect, 501 on our $461 cost for years, or that ratio,
Right.
which helped us put money in the bank and refresh capital and not need a subsidy. Chris, you'll be happy to know that when we told the city of Fort Worth that we really don't need their subsidy anymore, they should keep it and hire more cops and build more parks and hire some firefighters, whatever, they were funding us 1.5 million a year.
Oh, so it was
So
a lot. It went up then over the years.
yeah, and I think the 400 may have been when you started, when you still had hair here at MedStar.
That's a
But
good, that's a good one,
um,
Matt. Matt has jokes, everyone.
it's been, pretty high for
Yeah.
a while, but
Okay.
we limited it because of all the things that you were part of, that we gained a whole bunch of economic efficiency. We started our community paramedic program to take
Good.
out the low acuity non-paying patients and not having to burn all those unit hours going to those calls. And then we're able to monetize that, where people we're paying right now. Our margin on the mobile integrated healthcare program is higher than our margin on the EMS, because we're making money in the MIH program. We're losing money on the 911 side. But the size of those are much different. I mean, the cost of the EMS side is 60 million. The cost of the MIH side is, 2 million.
Sure.
So it's hard to do.
Yeah. Yeah, that is crazy. Let me ask you about the workforce. I mean, so when we think about the folks that are still there that started in 1986 when MedStar transitioned to MedStar, and we think about some of the team members we lost over the years, some great names in certainly Texas EMS, if not national EMS. What's the feeling of the workforce now? I mean, we would think about years, what would it be like to work under the fire service? But now as we start, and he was in the old days, Matt, when we were under a contractor, was when's the authority going to take this over? Because a lot of the public utility models is a three-legged stool. You have the medical director's office, you have the authority, you have a contractor. We got rid of the contractor years ago, like a lot of public utility models did. But what's the feeling in the workforce now in the tradition of MedStar? And I've seen some of the Facebook posts. It seems to be bittersweet, but how are they holding up?
Chris, our workforce, just like many EMS agencies, are very resilient. And I would say that the MedStar workforce is more resilient than most, because we're changing shit every day, right? We're introducing telemedicine, we're
Yep.
introducing, these new programs and treat and release payments and all sorts of different things. So they're pretty resilient and they're used to change. This is a fundamental shift in their employment conditions. And there are some, and you can probably think of them right at the front of your head, who are very anxious about this, anxious from a bad perspective. Um, there are some who think this is actually going to be good for them because the workload is going to be less, the pay is going to be more, they're going to get pensions instead of 401ks, they're going to, have some civil service protection. And that's what we've been pushing for, is the workforce deserves, especially those folks that have been with us for 20, 30 years. If it's going to go to the city, that's great. Reduce their workload, increase their benefits, increase their pay. We wish we could do that. And if you gave us the money, we could. But if you want to do that and it's going to be in the city, that's fine. But just treat them fairly. And they've been really good. The city's been really good about joint town halls with our leadership team and their leadership team to answer questions. They put up a live FAQ page where people can submit questions, and the city and others will respond to those questions. But Chris, as you know, in the workforce, there are people who do EMS because they want to do EMS. They don't want to do fire. There are people who would love to be in a fire-based system, but they really like the medicine. So I would say it's a little bit of a mixed bag. A third of the workforce really excited. They think it's going to be really good for them, and we agree, which is why we're pushing for the civil service categorization and single role. There are some who are really concerned about the culture of the fire service being way different than the culture of MedStar for sure, and EMS maybe in general. And there are some that are just a little bit ambivalent. And they feel, hey, you know what? If it says MedStar on the side of the truck, that's great. If it says Fort Worth Fire and Rescue, that's great. I'm still doing the calls. I'm still treating the patients. I'm still doing all that kind of stuff. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Um, and we're trying to be as communicative and transparent as we can with all three different types of responses that we're getting from our existing workforce. Where we see a lot of additional anxiety is in the supervisor, manager, and executive team ranks, because the city has a lot of that infrastructure.
Right.
So they have battalion chiefs, they have supervisors, they have, certainly HR people, they have finance people. They don't have a transformation person, but we're pretty sure they don't even want that because that might not be a thing for them. Um, so people are a little bit nervous, and should
Yeah.
they be looking around to do something different?
And that's always the hard part about being part of EMS leadership, is you don't know where you're going to go when these types of things happen. Speaking of which, I mean, I met you in 2008. I actually was part of the interview team that got to interview at the first met you. I got to drive you around the city and show you the system. And over 16 years, through your leadership with your team, you have created a system that EMS can be proud of, and not just the people of Fort Worth. But for you, Matt, I mean, I figured they were going to build you a little a burial plot in the back as one of the leaders that have been there close to 20 years. And MedStar still has a lot of people that were there when I was there that are in leadership roles. What's the future for you hold? I mean, I saw some news the other day about your transition. I actually thought initially that that was a consulting gig, that you were going to be working with them, but come to find out, you are making a transition full time. But I'll let you brief the career field on where you're going next.
Yeah, Chris, like you in the past and like the people here, I was all in on MedStar, and the EMS industry knew that I would never leave MedStar. It was part of my, and had some offers and chose not to take them because I just believed in the system. I believed in the community service and all that sort of stuff. Well, when it became pretty apparent that I may not be needed moving forward, people started asking, all right, Matt. So,
What are you going to do?
and the great news is that, the folks at Page Wolfberg and Worth and the folks at EMSMC, the EMS Management Consultants, they have a joint venture called PWW Advisory Group. And they shared that, they're getting a lot of projects and more projects coming, and they needed more bandwidth. They needed some additional expertise. They needed some things that they identified as a gap. And Steve and Doug and Greg and all the folks at that organization made it very clear that they would like me to join them. And I've known Steve and Doug and Greg now, but Steve and Doug for years and have a tremendous amount of respect for them. They're one of the people, Chris, that you just look at them and you're just like, genuflecting to the north when they come by. And to have the opportunity to go
Yeah.
full time with PWW Advisory Group to really do what we did here at MedStar over the last decade and a half, and now take that on a national level and help systems and communities all across the country do what we've been able to implement and show that it works
Mhm.
um, all across the country, and get to do it from my home state of Texas, Republic of Texas, and the house that Tessa and I just literally moved into, brand new house, beautiful subdivision, ranch subdivision, really, where our granddaughter lives, 2/10 of a mile away, was too good to pass up. And I'm just absolutely thrilled to do it, and very blessed, very blessed.
Well, we always wish you the best of luck, Matt. And you're a man that creates your own luck. I mean, if there's a person who believes that opportunity creates success, it is you, right? And I think that as a mentor of mine, you've given me the opportunity to understand some of that philosophy and leadership, and I respect and appreciate that. And Matt, as we get up there in time, this is really the end of an era, I think. Certainly, we're going to look for the next 11th appearance on the Inside EMS podcast for you and want you to continue to be part of that. But if you share a little bit about this experience with the listeners, I mean, we have both providers, we have leaders that listen to this. The big lesson of this is that there's probably no one system that is secure in the environment that we're in of today's EMS world. So if you give just kind of closing thoughts to the people who are listening about this experience you're in right now, what do you share with them?
Wow. You didn't tell me you were going to ask that question, Chris. So thank you for putting me on the spot, you dork.
Come on, you're good at improvisation. You're good at
I,
improv.
I think be prepared for change. Be prepared for transition, transformation, whatever you want to call it. We as a profession have not necessarily been as nimble as we need to, which means we have not created nimble leaders or nimble providers. And change is inevitable. We have to change. EMS as it exists today is not sustainable. And if the communities are committed to the EMS system, if they're committed to having the patient-centric service that they want, and they're going to write checks to support it, you need to prove your value. And Chris, we've been saying for
Yep.
a decade and a half that we as a profession need to be able to demonstrate value. And I would say that in our system, we did, because in essence, the city of Fort Worth is making a $10 to $20 million investment
Yeah, they're
in
buying
a
it.
system that they perceive to be valuable, and
Right.
employees and team members that they perceive to be valuable. And we choose to see that as a positive. Um, and I am changing roles and never thought I would. I thought I'd retire from MedStar. But the opportunity that I have now was something I never even dreamed of, and hadn't even prayed for it because I didn't even know it was available. So, and you did the same thing, Chris, in your career.
Yeah.
And you just never know when one door starts to close, there's 3 or 4 windows that open with people in the window saying, "Hey, come here, let me talk to you." Just be prepared for that and be willing to do it. Because people like you, Chris, like Kelly, in some respects myself, but there are people listening to this podcast that have a lot more difference to make in this profession than maybe they're doing today.
Yeah.
And they should look at what can they do next to have a bigger impact on EMS in the country.
Yeah, I like that. And one of the things I talk to my coaching clients about all the time is that you have a skill or you have knowledge or you have expertise that if you don't share with other people, you do them a disservice. And one of the things that we've always done in our careers as leaders is actually share that opportunity with the folks and added as much value as we can. But you have to remember yourself in this process as well. You said, I may not leave MedStar. I want to retire from MedStar. But as that opportunity opens, you got to do what you got to do for best for you and your family. But Matt, it's always great to talk to you. It's inspirational. It's motivational. And I wish you the best of luck in your new endeavors. And again, guest spot number 11. Don't forget it.
I'm ready whenever you are.
And
Thanks,
everybody
Chris.
out there, I mean, what do you think about this MedStar thing? I think this is something that people are talking about, right? And whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, history is going to be able to define us. But I got to tell you, man, I am not going to be surprised in a couple years to see a $50 million budget when it comes to running EMS for the city of Fort Worth. Well, man, I'm trying to be nice, but we'll see how that works out. But for Kelly Grayson, I'm Chris Saballero, and for our guest, Matt Zavadsky, I want to thank you for joining Inside EMS, and we'll talk to everyone again next week.